From the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17. Listen for the word of God. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And Jesus was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While Peter was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." This ends the reading. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? God of grace, again we ask for eyes that are able to see that which dazzles, for ears that are able to hear that which lies beyond our comprehension, and for hearts that are able to be transformed by your own appearance. Amen. So as I mentioned, this is a story that we can hear in a couple of different ways. And the first way that I want to invite you to hear it is to let your inner skeptic listen to the story. And when I say your inner skeptic, I don't use that term pejoratively. I appreciate our inner skeptic. This is the thing inside of us that doubts until we know for certain. It's the thing that keeps us from walking off of ledges or running into walls or saying wildly inappropriate things out loud. It's the stuff we learn from the school of hard knocks. And from that school of hard knocks, we learn that we can trust some things and perhaps not trust other things. And we become somewhat skeptical because we've been burnt once on this hot stove and we imagine that it will burn again. And we know that the law of gravity is going to be fairly consistent. And we know that a broken heart doesn't mend easily. These are all lessons that we've learned along the way. And that inner skeptic inside of us, it makes us cautious to just willy-nilly accept everything that we encounter. So let's hear how our inner skeptic might encounter this story that we call the story of the Transfiguration. Because I will tell you, there's a lot here in this story that really puts our inner skeptic on edge. First of all, you have the description that Jesus was transfigured in front of the disciples. We're not entirely sure what that means. It may be something in itself. It may be explained by the next few descriptions. But the word there, it's an interesting word. It's the Greek word metamorpho, from which we get our word metamorphosis. It's never translated transfigured except for in this text, because that's what the King James Bible called it, and every translation since then has towed the line, because that's what we now call it. But there's something about it, that description that says Jesus became something else. And our inner skeptic doesn't know what to do with that. It's either A or not A, but it's not A and not A at the same time. What do we do with Jesus who's suddenly transformed into something other than the Jesus they know? It's hard to kind of wrap our head around that. And the next thing that's described is that his face becomes radiant like the sun. And we've seen perhaps sweaty faces that glisten a little bit in the sun, but radiant like the sun, that lies outside of our experience, and we're not real sure of what to do with that. And if that weren't bad enough, suddenly his clothing became so bright, brilliantly bright. The term there is borrowed from the Old Testament. It refers to the old office of a fuller, somebody who would take a fabric and bring out its original brightness. Jesus' clothes became bright and brilliant. And I know there are going to be 1,001 sermons today throughout Christendom about how this is the moment when you get to see Jesus' divine reality kind of emerging from his human reality. But honestly, this particular description is about fabric. It's about his clothing. His clothes became brilliantly white. Whatever you want to make of the hypostatic union of the divine and human Christ, go for it. But this is his clothes we're talking about. They became brilliantly white. And our inner skeptic is like, wait a minute. And if that's not bad enough, in the story, suddenly Jesus is talking to Moses and Elijah. Moses has been dead for a millennium. Elijah technically never died. He just kind of took off in a fiery chariot, which is hard enough for our inner skeptic. But now, having not been seen for 800 years, here he is again. Boom. And then a bright cloud, I'm not sure what that is, and a voice from the cloud, I'm relatively sure I don't want to know what that sounds like, proclaiming, "This is my beloved Son." You see how all of these details of this story taken in themselves really kind of press against us, because if we read this story the way that we typically read stories, or the way that we typically encounter experience, what we would find ourselves saying is, come on, you expect me to believe that? Someone changes into something else? Someone's face is shiny, their clothes are shiny, dead people hanging around? Voices from the cloud? If you meet somebody who tells you they heard a voice from the cloud, you're going to walk a wide circle around that person and report them to the proper authorities, right? Because these are things that lie outside of our experience. And because of that, what we tend to do with this story is either we treat it as one of these little special Jesus stories in a category all in its own that we don't read like we do all of our other stories, or we find ways to dismiss it. Because it's a hard story for our inner skeptic, at every point pushing back. But there's another way of reading the story, and that's through the lens of wonder. Through the lens of wonder. You know, we have experiences in our life, like the first time we see someone and fall in love with them, or first time we hold a child. The first time, perhaps, that we've ever really reckoned with the stars in the sky, and it gives us a sense of how small we are in the universe, but how wonderful it is that we're here. These moments of wonder, we can't turn to the skeptics and the scientists and the philosophers to give us a language for it. We turn to poets and musicians. Because this is one of those parts of the human experience that really lies beyond our analysis. So it's just as authentic to human life to be caught up in wonder as it is to be skeptical. So what happens with the story when we read it through the lens of our inner poet of wonder? Well, all the stuff that bothered us when we read it as skeptics get flipped on their heads. Because now suddenly you see the possibility that Jesus, whom we have encountered so far in this story, whom the disciples have trod up this mountain with, can be much more than what meets the eye. So when Jesus is transfigured before them, it's finally a moment where they're getting to see that inner depth that so many artists have tried to capture by turning paintings inside out, by giving us songs that just brilliantly go up and down the chromatic scale until finally they reach a resting point, because they're trying to show us that more than just the superficial on the outside, there's a depth and a meaning on the inside. Or think about that moment when Jesus' face shines like the sun, as the narrator puts it. You know, the sun is probably the most powerful, radiant reality you and I will ever see. and for someone to take that powerful radiance of the sun and to place it on Jesus' face. The face. That's how we encounter each other, with faith. That's how we know each other. When I say your name, I think of your face, not your shoes, right? This is how we know. This is who we are to one another. And in that moment, our inner poet allows us to see how fabulous this moment was, that when they looked at Jesus' face, it's as if they saw the brilliance of 1,000 suns. Because I will tell you, they will look on that face later in the story, having been bloodied and beaten and bruised and crucified on the cross. But once you see that brilliance and radiance, you never unsee it. Imagine how transformative it is to see the face, radiant like the sun. And all the other details, the shiny clothes, the dead and missing people are suddenly reappearing. Can you imagine what the poet is saying in this story when Moses and Elijah appear? Suddenly, we're not trapped in time anymore. When we're trapped in time, they're people from the past. They've been gone for a millennium. But when we are somehow transcending time, Moses, Elijah, Jesus, you can all be in fellowship at the same time. It's that great cloud of witnesses that we talk about, that our journey is never simply locked into our moment. This is a beautiful way of expressing the transcendence of our journey by having Moses and Elijah, these superstars from the past, suddenly present. So you see, while our inner skeptic can look at this story and dismiss point after point after point and kind of call the whole thing into question, our inner poet looks at this story and says, oh man, this is powerful. And both of them are genuine, authentic parts of our experience. And we read the story through both of those lenses. But there's a part of the story that I do not want us to overlook. And that is in the story when the voice from the clouds tells Peter to stop breaking the moment, and to listen to Jesus. Suddenly Peter and James and John are overcome with this moment, and they fall on their faces. And the scriptures say that Jesus came over to them and said, do not be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw just plain old Jesus. Not shiny Jesus. Not Jesus with the brilliant clothes. Not Jesus standing with long dead Moses and disappeared Elijah. Not Jesus being proclaimed by a voice out of the clouds. Just plain old Jesus, who invites them to get up and who walks alongside of them as they come down the mountain. Probably sweaty from having ascended that mountain earlier. His clothes probably filled with a lot of Galilean dust. That Jesus walking beside them. And that's the moment in this story I want to invite you to embrace today. A couple weeks ago, Hayes and I had a chance to attend a pastor's retreat, and we had a chance to hear Cynthia Rigby, one of my favorite Presbyterian theologians from Austin Seminary, talk to us about wonder. And she told us an incredible story about a woman who faced a lot of physical challenges, and basically it left, between the challenges she faced and the surgeries she had, it really left her body mangled, difficult to look at. And she would speak to different Christian groups about her faith through all of her perilous journey. And at one point, some well-meaning person kind of raised their hand during the Q&A period and said, do you feel like maybe that story about the footprints where God has carried you in your difficult times? So let me make sure you know what we're talking about. It's a story that's been around since at least when I was in college, and it's appeared on a number of little wall plaques and so forth. And it's a lovely story. It's about someone who's with Jesus, and they see two sets of footprints walking along the beach. And they discern that this is their journey with Jesus walking beside them. But at one point, suddenly, there's only one set of footprints. And so they ask Jesus, "Did you leave? Did you leave me at this part of my journey?" And Jesus' response is, "No. This is a part of the journey where I picked you up and carried you." So they're Jesus' footprints that you see. And it's a lovely story, and there are moments in my life. I remember the first time I heard it, I cried. It was just so powerful. So someone asked this woman who was so mangled in her body, "Do you feel like the story of footprints that Jesus carried you?" And she said, "No way." She said, "I have walked every inch of this journey. There's not been a point where I haven't had to take the next step and the next. It's been difficult, but I've had to do it." She said, "What I see on that beach is not one set of footprints where I'm being carried, but always two. Because I've never been alone in this difficult journey." And that's the just plain old Jesus I want to invite you to open your eyes and to embrace throughout your journey. This is the Jesus who knows what it's like to stand up against the powers that be on behalf of the oppressed and to be put to death for it. This is the Jesus who knows what it's like to stand in solidarity with those who have been kicked out of sacred places and to be considered unclean himself. This is the Jesus who knows what it's like to do the right thing even when all of his friends and closest followers abandon him. This is the Jesus who walked beside Peter, James, and John right after they blew that holy moment, right? You got this holy moment where they're seeing this wonderful vision, and a dumb old Peter just said, "Hey, Jesus, you want me to build something?" And suddenly it's over. Right? He ruins it, right? He ruins it. And that little cad who just ruined things, Jesus walks with him. He doesn't say, "That's it, Peter, you're off the mountain, buddy." I would have been tempted to do that myself. Instead, Jesus walks with him. And this is the Christ who will walk with you when you've blown it royally, when you've said the wrong thing, when you've had your doubts, when your inner skeptic doesn't know how to wrap its heart around all of this. This is the Jesus who walks with you during the season of Lent, when we consider our own mortality in our own brokenness. This is the Christ, just plain old Jesus, who will never leave us or forsake us. Thanks be to God. Amen.